us. Today we have Massimo Morelli from Bocconi, who's going to present complexity and the reform process. This is joint work with Dana Foarta, who's also with us, and she'll help us answer questions through the chat. Before I hand over to Massimo, let me remind you that these webinars take place every 2 weeks on Mondays at 3 p.m. UK time. In 2 weeks, we will have with us Marco Malacorda from Queen Mary. As usual, you can find more information about the upcoming list of speakers and past seminars on our website. You can also follow us on Twitter and watch past talks on the YouTube channel. A reminder, the format of a seminar is as follows: a 50-minute presentation, more or less, followed by a 10-minute discussion and questions. Please keep your microphones muted and cameras turned off. But Dana's with us, so you can ask questions via chat. After the Q&A that is at the top of the hour, we will finish the official part of the seminar. We'll stop the recording, but everybody's welcome to stay and chat informally. Massimo, thank you for accepting our invitation, and the screen is yours.
Thank you for the invitation to talk about this paper with Dana. So the questions we are going to address, or we are trying to address with this paper, relate, as the title suggests, to the reform process. And you can obviously have plenty of examples from current times about things that are happening that require reforms of laws and regulation, going from technological changes, artificial intelligence, and to situation changes like the climate change require policy reforms or regulation reforms. And one could add, cyber attacks or space-related, investments, and then the pandemics itself, and you name it, the importance of the Twitter and other and similar forms of communication these days, how copyright and other type of issues need to be regulated differently, and so on. So there is always a constant flow, if you wish, of things that need to be reformed to bring the regulations in line with the changes again in technology or in situations, right? And then abstracting from the details of each type of reform problem, there is always some either institutionally decided or not proposer. It could be a politician, a bureaucratic agency, or an interest group who is going to propose a reform, and it is going to go through a set of checks typically, and at the end there's going to be a decision maker. Which could be again a politician or a majority in Congress or a judicial or presidential veto or whatever. Right? So, but in very abstract terms, you can think about a very important information problem that the decision maker, whoever that player is in whichever of these reform situations will have an information problem. We'll have to try to figure out whether the proposer is someone who is competent enough to make the right proposal, or has, as part of the proposal, also an implementation agency that is going to do the job well, and the decision maker has to worry about the consequences of that proposal, right? So whether or not it's competently done and it's easy to implement, that's one question, and whether the proposal, even when competently executed, is good for society is a separate question. It's a more of a common value question, right? And the way in which whoever the decision maker in a reform problem is so the difficulty that the decision maker has in accessing that information depends on the complexity of the reform and the complexity of the environment, right? So if it's a reform on the network of laws, it depends both on how complex that reform is per se, but also on how complex the network of laws is, where this new injection of regulation is going to interact, right? Therefore, the goal of the paper is to talk about this nexus, the relationship between the choice of making a reform simple versus complex as a function of the complexity of the environment, and then also explore the other direction, namely how the equilibrium reforms that will appear in every period shape endogenously the complexity of the environment. Okay, so that's pretty much the topic of the talk. And since I mentioned complexity in a mouthful, I mentioned complexity of the environment and complexity of the reform. Let me stress the connection between the two, right? So the fact that the complexity of the environment creates informational extraction problem for a decision maker is well known, and it's studied in different contexts. What we add is that on top of that complexity of the environment that makes life harder for a decision maker, there is also another element of complexity that is related perhaps more to the reform, namely, the reform, the more contingencies the reform has, and the more complicated the reform is, the more it requires competence, it requires alignment of interest between the proposer and the public, between the implementation agencies and the public. Okay? So the model is going to capture both types of complexity. Namely, we are going to see, before I'm not giving you yet a view of the model, but we are going to try to see how the complexity of the reforms, the choice of how complex the reform you want to make depends on the complexity of the environment and vice versa. Okay? So I hope that this mouthful of complex words slowly is going to take some precise shape. So to reiterate, therefore, the questions we're going to ask are the following. First of all, in what sense the political and economic characteristics of the decision-making process that involves proposers and decision makers affects which type of reforms are chosen, and in particular, under what conditions more complex reforms are taken, and in particular, when do we have inefficiently high complexity chosen in any given period. And then, of course, the question of the dynamic consequences of that will be a primary goal of the paper. And finally, the final set of questions that I raised at the bottom of the slide, we're going to try to relate the predictions of this model to the empirical findings on legislative complexity and growth, legislative complexity and bureaucratic efficiency. So as a preview of the model, we need to know what are the minimal characteristics that one would want in a model to tackle all these issues. So what we think is that the minimal you need is, first of all, a strategic interaction between a proposer and a decision maker, because as we will see, and we will do this explicitly at the end of the paper, this is what creates already a great departure from the situation in which you have a single decision maker. Then, of course, things could get complicated as you wish with more than two players, but at least two gives us enough complexity. And what we need is also two levels of asymmetric information, because again, both the competence and the alignment of interest of the proposal decision maker on the one hand, and whether a type of reform is good for the state of the world, both therefore this private and common value of asymmetric information must matter for the story we're going to tell. And finally, we want to endow the proposer with at least the choice between a reform that is more complex and a reform that is more that is simpler. And you can think of a complex reform as a reform that determines multiple contingencies under which different prescriptions are suggested, versus a simple kind of blanket policy that would have, of course, would be much easier to understand but perhaps it's not exactly what the economy needs. Okay, so to give an example, you can think, for example, of the Paris Agreement type of situations where we kind of agree that, and we have set in the Paris Agreement a greenhouse emission cut objective, but each country could, in principle, propose, could have a different procedure through which the actual emission cuts in various industries are selected. There could be, or there surely are countries that go for equal cut across industries, and there are cases in which instead there are multiple contingencies and very complex decisions also in terms of intertemporal, how to get there, how to get to the finish line. And similarly also for the pandemics, of course, you have the choice to give, for example, a flat subsidy to all businesses, or flat tax cut to all individuals in the society, or you can decide to tailor-make the policy to what you think would be the classes of people that are most affected by the pandemics, and so on and so forth. And of course, if you go in that direction of the more contingent set of reforms, then you better do it right, because otherwise you both create trouble in the short run for not having used the funds in the proper way in that very moment. Plus, you make it in any case, as the bottom of this slide suggests, more complicated later on for the evaluation of future policies or future reforms. The fact that you have created so many advantages for some and costs for others makes the evaluation of the needs of the next reform much more complicated. Okay? So that's the type of situation we're in. So what do we find as a preview? So
Massimo,
first of all, yes.
Can I stop you? I have a quick question. When you think of a proposer having a type and so on, are you thinking of situations where maybe the proposer, for example, with respect to climate change thing, is actually in bad faith? So is proposing, for example, something complex to make it harder to actually implement it?
Yeah, so as you will see, the model adapts well both to the case in which the asymmetric information about the proposer is about competence or ability, and also to the case where the private information is about interest alignment, right? So the interest groups, proposers, with the decision maker being the regulator, is the application where your suggested example would be appropriate. And we'll show you hopefully how the results we have apply to that case as well. Okay. So as a preview result, I said in the static model, you take the complexity of the environment as given, and what we show is that the likelihood that the reform proposed is going to be a complexification one is non-monotonic in the competence or alignment of interest in your other example that you mentioned of the proposal. And another way to put it is that even if there is a perceived need, a quite likely need of a complex reform, the actual equilibrium frequency of complex reforms are non-monotonic in the competence of the implementer. Okay, whereas this is actually not the case when you have a single decision maker. So this is one key prediction even for potential future empirical applications, because it's a clear case in which the strategic interaction between proposals and decision makers generates a result that is different from a single decision maker. In terms of the dynamics, what we find is that when there is enough uncertainty about whether the state of the world is one that requires complexity or not, and there remains a kind of intermediate belief about the competence or alignment of the proposers. In those intermediate cases, there can actually be cycles. So the reforms can be can display a sequence of complexifications and simplifications. Whereas when the system would need to require would seem to need more complexification, but the quality of the proposers is bad, or the suspicion that the proposer is going to be captured by an elite or things like that. In those cases, the equilibrium is going to be displayed. Okay, so we're going to have both path dependence and cycles that under some of the different conditions in the dynamic element. So in terms of the roadmap, therefore, I'll start with the static model, then we'll do the dynamics with one period short-lived agents, the stationary model, and then we'll add the analysis, or at least in terms of comparison with that baseline, we look at what happens when you have long-lived proposers or long-lived decision makers. And finally, we'll talk about some applications. Because the time is not enormous for this seminar, in terms of related literature, I will just mention briefly what types of literatures we could relate our results to without going into details. So clearly the literature on incrementalism or reforms is going to be a relevant one for the comparisons, because we are only going to deal with incremental reforms, and we have some plans for the future for being able to compare incremental reforms with actual major reforms or revolutions. Okay, but the revolutions are out of the picture for this paper. And then the relevant literature that we try to speak to is the literature on regulatory complexity, to which Dana has other very important contributions, and the literature on legislative complexity and efficiency, to which I've tried recently to contribute. And then finally, one could find some connection, especially the theorists in the audience, with communication, games, and with the Ottaviani Sorensen and type of expert communication type literature. And maybe in the Q&A, some people will ask about connection, for example, with the incomplete context literature. But this is just a list of potential literatures that you might be interested in. Okay, let's go to the model. So as I said, as economists, it's a very simple model, just two players here. There is a proposer and a decision maker. And there are two states of the world, theta C and theta S. Theta C is the state of the world in which the new technological change that happened is one that requires a complex rule. Some rule that says, if this happens, then they should do that. If that instead happens, then this other thing should happen, and you should monitor that this and that other way. And theta S is the state of the world in which instead, like some kind of flat or blanket policy would be best given the circumstances. And theta C has probability kappa, so keep this kappa in mind, because we're going to use it. It's going to be one of the parameters, the key parameters of the model, that is, an economy or a particular situation. One of the things that describes that situation is what is the prior, let's say, by the decision maker, the kappa prior, that indeed the rule should be complex. Okay? Now, the proposer also has high ability with probability pi, and instead, is instead a bad type with probability 1 minus pi. Once again, for the question that Francesco asked before, this pi could also be the probability with which the decision maker thinks that the proposer has aligned interests with him or with the voters. Okay? The decision maker is going to be benevolent. So sometimes when I compare, when I talk about alignment of interest, could be with the decision maker with the voters, because the voters are not in the model; they're just in the motivation of the instance. Okay, so So these are the players, right? So a proposer that is either good or bad and has observed the state of the world perfectly, but the decision maker hasn't observed the state of the world directly and doesn't know the type, whether it's good or bad, of the proposal. Okay? So in terms of actions, therefore, the game is the simplest one you can imagine. The proposer, endowed with his or her own level of ability and his or her observation of the state, makes a proposal, which could be YS or YC. So the simplification or a complexification of the status quo. And the decision maker only observes a noisy signal raw of the state of the world, and does not observe, of course, the ability of the proposer. So, and the signal has precision 1 minus z. So with probability 1 minus z, the signal is exactly telling you correctly what the state of the world is. With probability z, it's going to make you make a mistake. So z is going to be between z mean and 1/2. So in any case, the signal is better than nothing. But if it goes close, if it's closer to 1/2, it's a very noisy signal. Okay, and given that signal, the DM updates his or her beliefs that about the state of the world, of course, and given all that information and the prior pi, and decides whether to accept or reject d equals to 1 or 0 the proposal. Okay? That's a very simple game. And now the payoffs. So we want the payoffs, the simplest possible payoffs, to capture that there are those two types of issues that matter. So when the proposal is simple, then it doesn't take rocket science to implement a flat tax cut or a flat subsidy for everybody, right? So in that case, the ability of the proposer or the real intentions behind those proposals, etc., don't matter very much. And therefore, the simplest way to put it is that in case of an accepted proposal YS, the utility for the decision maker or for society only depends on the state of the world, right? So if the state of the world was indeed one in which a flat policy was the right thing for the economic shock, then you get a positive utility V from the reform if you passed it. Whereas if you don't match the state, if you're proposing something simple in a situation in which you would have needed a lot of contingencies and so on, then with respect to the status quo, because the baseline utility, if the DM rejects the proposal, is normalized to 0, then you have a negative loss, minus F. Okay? In the case in which the proposal that is made and accepted is in fact a complexification proposal, YC, now the matrix shows you that you have the key factor is whether you have a competent proposal or implementation agency that guarantees you that those contingencies are not going to screw up the entire legal system or the entire regulation. But on top of that, you have a minus A, which captures the fact that so there is a cost A from doing unnecessary complexification of the law when it's not needed, right? So when you start writing a complex reform or a complex law or a complex regulation, when it's not needed, all the administrative costs, which maybe is the reason why we call it A, or even a political cost to approve the various amendments and so on, is useless, right? So there is this minus A that captures that as well. Okay, very good. So, and for another important final assumption is that for the proposers, what we assume is that they just care about passing the proposal. Okay. So if you think about a politician who is trying to signal his or her quality as a reformer, in the short run, he or she just cares that the majority in Congress passes her bill. Okay, whether it's a complexification or a simplification bill. We will see how this is robust to later on when we abandon the simplest possible mention. So the equilibrium concept is the best perfect Bayesian equilibrium. And so, as usual, you should think about what are the strategies of the two players. So for the decision maker, the strategy is a mapping from the set of, for the triplet, where the first component of the triplet is the signal she got. The second is the message Y, or the proposal she received from the proposer. And the third is the level of complexity of the environment that makes her, information extraction noisy or not, right? So based on the triplet rho Y, Z, there will be a decision and a decision mapping. And for the proposer, the proposal of making a complexification or a simplification will depend, of course, still on the level of complexity, because that has implication on what the proposer thinks that the decision maker is likely to understand and to accept or not. And of course, depends on what is the observed state of the world, because the proposer does observe the state of the world. So these two strategies have to be, the decision maker strategy has to be optimal given the belief about the state of the world, and the proposer must propose something that is best respond to what he expects the decision maker to do given her proposal. And so to simplify this mouthful for the simple game that we have defined, at the end of the day, the optimal strategies are actually pretty simple. For the decision maker, since the decision maker is comparing the status quo that he would obtain, that she would obtain by simply rejecting the proposal, with the value of the proposal, is simply accepting in any given moment, she's accepting any proposal that has an expected utility greater than zero. So that's super simple. And for the proposer who just wants the deal to be approved, is going to choose the proposal that maximizes the probability that the decision maker will accept it. Okay? So that is in terms of how, in abstract terms, the optimal strategies are going to look like. Now, this is the characterization and I will try to explain with the picture next the details. But first, let me tell you from this slide. Okay, very good. Okay, so what types of equilibria are going to appear? Then in the picture that comes next, I will try to explain why do they belong to different, why each of them belongs to a different subset of the kappa pi space. Yeah? So first of all, the characterization of equilibrium in a given equilibrium is also for a given triplet kappa pi z, right? So we are taking a snapshot in a given moment where you have a given complexity of the environment z, and you have a given prior of whether society needs something more complex or not, which is kappa, and a given prior about the quality of the proposals. And so for every triplet kappa pi z, what types of equilibria can you have? So one equilibrium that you can have is what we call the simplification equilibrium, which is in a sense the best we have here, where the good types are matching the state, which is what obviously we want them to do. And in a sense, the bad type do least damage by always proposing a simple strategy where they do the least damage. Right? Then there is going to be what we call a matching equilibrium, where both types, or basically it's like, there's both the good and the bad type are matching the state, even though the bad type knows that for her to propose a complexification is going to impose cost to society, which she doesn't have. And then there is the complexification equilibrium, where in fact, on top of the bad type matching the state, which is bad for us because we wouldn't want the bad type to propose complex rules and screw up the system. On top of that, there exist also incentives for the good type to actually propose complexification all the time, even when actually the state of the world would require simplification. And we will see why this could be this could be the case. In a sense, this complexification equilibrium that the third one in this list is the one, in a sense, most problematic because you have distortions on both sides, right? So there is too much activism from bad types, but also too much complexification, even when it's unnecessary by the good types. And then for low levels of pi, there's going to be pooling on simplicity, and there's going to be. So let me show you. Let me explain you a little bit how all these different equilibria appear by using a picture. Okay, so fix v equals 1, L equals 1, and A, I think, was 0.35 or something. So there's some numerical cases just to make a picture, right? And so you have kappa on the x-axis, so and pi on the vertical axis. So, for example, just to use the language properly, the bottom right would be, in a sense, the worst situation in terms of expectations, right? For the decision maker, you have the situation in which the system would seem to require a complexification because kappa is high, but the opinion about the proposer is terrible, pi is very low. And so as maybe one could already expect, in that case, the decision maker is actually preferring the status quo to taking the risk to give the driver's seat to an incompetent driver, right? But where I need to make a more difficult effort to try to explain you how the other three equilibria kind of can be placed on the picture is of course the top right? Because on the top left, again, it's not so difficult to understand. If kappa is low, it means that most likely a simple policy is going to be good because kappa is low, and therefore there is no need for the high type to have any distortion or distorted behavior. So the high type is going to match the state, and the bad type by proposing simplification is matching in expectation a positive expected utility for the approval for the decision maker. So clearly the simplification equilibrium is pretty easy to understand that belongs to the top left. Again, the part where now I'll try hard is starting from top right and going slowly down towards the bottom, right? So let's take a point on the kappa pi space that is on the pi 1 of kappa z curve. Now, what is that pi 1 of kappa z curve? That pi 1 of kappa z curve is the locus of all kappa pi points given z, where the decision maker is indifferent between accepting the simplification proposal, accepting a proposal under the assumption that the equilibrium is the simplification equilibrium, and the status quo. Okay? Now, what happens if, for example, you imagine now a level of pi slightly below that? So you start from a kappa pi point on the pi 1 of kappa z curve, and now you take a level of pi slightly below that, where if the expected behavior of the proposer was conforming to the simplification equilibrium, then the decision maker would have to reject. Okay? Then the best equilibrium with that lower pi is not to let the decision maker reject, because the bad type basically is better off now matching the equilibrium, matching the strategy of matching the state. Because with even though pi is below that indifference point, if the expectation now is that the bed type is matching the state, the expected utility from the proposal is now better than zero, right? Because we are still on the pi relatively high, such that if the bed type now proposes the complexification with that probability of being good, it's still better than zero. So the fact that the equilibrium is matching at that stage, sorry, that the best equilibrium is the matching one, is the best I could do is explain it this way. When instead you go below pi 2, so what is pi 2? Pi 2 is the locus so is the level of pi such that having both players matching the state would give exactly equal utility to the decision maker with respect to status quo again. So if you don't move, if the proposer doesn't change the behavior, the decision maker is going to stop there. But then at that point, it's the proposer who is a high type distorts his behavior. Right? For levels of pi between pi 2 and pi 3, it's convenient, given that the high type wants the decision maker to accept the proposal. It's convenient for him to always complexify, because in that case, the posterior belief of the decision maker when he sees a complexification proposal is that it comes with high probability from the high type, because the high type is now complexifying all the time. So if you see complexification proposal, the posterior is higher than it's coming from him, because in fact the bed type is still matching the state. Okay, so that's the more difficult part, let's say, to explain. I hope I at least gave you a hint, and maybe you have some other qualifications for damage you can try that. Now, what is the implication of this characterization from the point of view of the questions we K bar and pi 3? Okay, so then you can explain that. Okay, sorry. So rather than explaining all those areas hope, then I will try to answer all your questions about those areas of the pictures where you still have doubts. But I want to make you focus on the most important part, right? Why did I make you focus mostly on the right of the picture and going from top to bottom? Because I wanted to convince you about something that is quite relevant for the question of when do we expect to see the most complexifications in reality, right? Is it when the competent types? Is it when the proposers are expected to be very competent? No. At the very top of the graph, where pi is very high, the best equilibrium is actually simplification equilibrium. The bed type is not going to mess with that. Okay. And you have therefore the problematic areas is exactly the area between pi 1 and pi 3, because in the whole range, the vertical range from pi 1 to pi 3, you have the distortion incentives for the bed types to actually match the state in their proposal. And on top of that, between pi 1 and pi 2, it's the area where also the high types are distorting their behavior, and so you also have unnecessary proposals of complexifications by the high types. Okay, so here you see therefore the kind of graphically the non-monotonicity that I was talking about. It's precisely in the intermediate cases between pi 1 and pi 2 that you have both types of distortions at the same time. You have the maximum level of complexity, whatever, even if you are fixing the complexity of the environment itself, right? Z is fixed, the noise is fixed in this picture. That is the area where you expect the reforms themselves to be unnecessarily and badly complex. And then, as you will see, this is precisely the area where then in the dynamics, things are going to be messed up even more because then once you make the complexity of the environment endogenous, it's precisely in that area of the picture that there's going to be, path dependence of the bed type, right? More and more complexity is going to accumulate, and with that more and more complexity accumulated, more and more the incentives of the two types are going to be of that type, which is kind of in line with the complexity begets complexity points that then are also brought home in other papers, and it's in line with the Kafka-esque equilibrium predictions that I obtained from Weber to Kafka. And this brings me to this slide. So the two other papers I have on this topic that are more empirical, at prima facie would give you a contradictory set of results in terms of the relationship between legislative complexity and efficiency or growth. Okay, so in the paper that I have with Graton, Guiso, and Michelacci, forthcoming on the AER, what we show, and we apply to Italy, is that indeed signaling incentives, especially in periods of particularly high political instability, can actually generate a lot of the bad type of legislative complexity, which is going to lower the quality of laws and is going to affect negatively the efficiency of bureaucracy. Whereas in the other paper I have with Elliot Ash and Mattia Vannoni, the result on the state competition in terms of legislative reforms in the 50 states in the US, the results there are pretty much the opposite, namely that especially the legislative reforms that increase the completeness of the social contract by adding more contingent clauses, especially those are actually beneficial for growth. But the way to reconcile these two things in our model with Dana is actually pretty simple. If you start from an intermediate level of pi, roughly, for example, on the pi1 curve, like where I made you start before with the intuition, and from that point you see how would you depict the shocks created by political instability in Italy from in the early 90s. You would say, roughly speaking, that reduces pi. There is an explicit proposition in that paper for this to this account, but in general, political instability generates enough noise and enough changes in the signal incentives that the quality of politicians went down and the quality of expected proposal went down. So a downward shock of pi for a given kappa, so for a given set of economic and technological needs, will bring you into the area of the parameters where there is complexification of the bed type. Okay. Whereas if you are in a setup like the US state level legislation, where most of the new state level legislation and reform activities is through diffusion, is copying what another state has done well, and where the proposals are made by specialized bureaucratic agencies and so on, there the expectation is that pi perhaps for that same kappa is going to be higher, and for that reason you are going to only the complexifications that are coming from the high types are basically appearing on the equilibrium pi. So small changes in pi are going to generate dramatically different consequences, both in the short run and of course especially in the long run. So speaking of which, let's now try to say something about the dynamics. So far I told you what was the characterization of equilibria for a given z and for a given kappa and for a given pi. Now you fix the kappa and pi, so you fix the situation in terms of the fundamentals, but now you let z evolve with time. So in every period, you have a realization from an IID distribution of the thetas, perhaps with the same probability, that's fine. And then the complexity level at time t plus 1, we assume it to be equal to so in case in which there is a complexification, it's equal to the mean between ZT plus delta and 1/2. And in case of simplification, it's going to be the max between ZT minus delta and Z min. Okay? So this way, we have a direct effect of a complexification on the complexity of the environment.
Massimo,
yes.
Massimo, you have between 5, technically 5. We can have a little.
So I'll try to get to the main dynamic point. Okay, so this picture shows you first of all how complexity moves on that same picture. So when you complexify with the new reform, what happens? Well, Z increases, and when Z increases, the important thing is that the pi1 and the pi3 curves are actually going down. Why? Because if you are indifferent before, and now with the more noisy signal, because Z has increased, you give more weight to the prior, so you accept more. Okay? So if you accept more because you give more weight to the prior, then the pi1 and pi3 are shifting down. But on the other hand, the kappa bar is shifting to the left, so the gridlock area is actually increasing. Okay? So with this in mind, and this is just in general, what results can we get in the dynamic analysis? First of all, you can get cycles. In the areas depicted in this little picture in this slide, you have two types of cycles. The top area is cycles between simplifications and matching, and the bottom area is between simplification and complexifications. So in both cases, the idea is similar, right? When you complexify in one period, the level of complexity of the environment increases. So Z goes up, which means that the curves go down. But then if the curves go down, you can shift from a situation in which complexification was more likely to a situation in which simplification is more likely, because now you could be above the curve that shifted downwards. And therefore, the frequency of simple choices increases, and then the Z, once you simplify a few more times, the curves go back up, and you can go back to the matching area. So that's the reason why you can have these complexification patterns. Well, so given that there is limited time, I won't dwell on exactly what determines the average complexity when you are in a kappa pi situation where you have cycles. But again, the important thing that distinguishes this model and its results from others is again in line with the non-monotonicity we saw in the static model, is that the Z star, so the average complexity whenever the system rotates around it, is actually decreasing in pi. So therefore, it's precisely when pi is low that actually the level of complexity tends to be high. So, and this is the second big implications of the dynamic analysis, namely that on top of that area of potential cycles that I have highlighted, on the center and bottom, you have a lot of path dependence. Yeah? You have a lot of areas of the picture where, depending on where you start from in terms of your initial complexity of the environment, you can have, for high levels of such complexity of the environment, you can have further complexity begets complexity types of situations, or you could get stuck in gridlock. Whereas if you start from low Z, there is more trust in the signals by the decision maker, and therefore you can have either cycles or, for lower level of pi, a pooling equilibrium where, at least when the signal is a simplicity, the decision maker accepts the simplification proposal. Okay, so I don't have time for the details, but basically just to tell you at least two major changes that happens when the environment is not stationary. So when you allow the decision maker to be long-lived, then the simplest intuition you can have is that, even with two periods, is that okay, the second period decision makers behave exactly like in the stationary model we have analyzed, but in the period before, of course, it's going to take into account that the complexity of the environment has caused itself, and therefore, if anything, is going to bias with respect to the baseline results, the acceptance thresholds in a way that less complexity is going to be appearing in equilibrium, but the cost of that is that we're going to have more gridlock, or less good complex reforms are going to be approved. And the opposite is true when the proposer has long tenure, right? Because as soon as the proposer lives for more than one period, then he has signaling incentives. And there, when there are signaling incentives, the problem is, like again in line with for example, with the from Weber to Kafka paper, is that at that point the incentives of the proposer is always to complexify, to show competence. And so the over complexification that we already obtained as in an area of the kappa pi parameters, even with short-lived agents, that area expands in the case in which the proposer can be a long-lived agent with single incentive. Okay, so therefore we can skip now the regulation application and go to the conclusion not to upset Francesco. So in conclusion, so this is a model that hopefully is going to be, at least for us, certainly for me and Dana, a workhorse of the relationships between complexity and reform activities that are objectives of many political economy works. And the results we achieved are the following. So first of all, indeed the competence of proposers or the alignment of interest of the proposers plays an important role, especially for intermediate levels, right? For very high levels, you have a lot of action, but it's of the good type. For very low levels, you may have gridlock problems. For intermediate levels and high need of change, you have the problem that you can get into a very, very highly complexification path that will lead to a high complexity of the environment and science. Okay? So what we are thinking for future, then of course I'll skip the repeating myself on the dynamics, given that I didn't have time to explain you the details. And let me tell you one intuition we have about where, for example, the starting point for an analysis of revolutions versus reforms would be. Right? If you are in a situation that is like the bottom right of the picture, where we have a lot of lots of needs of change, right? Kappa is probably very high because there are lots of difficult things that are coming up, artificial intelligence and climate change. So all these are quite difficult. So kappa is likely to be very high, but there is very little trust in our elites, and there is very little trust in the enlightenment, in the alignment of interest, in competence of our leaders. Right? So we are exactly in the bottom right. And in the bottom right, this model basically tells you that no incremental reform is going to be even accepted by decision makers. Of course, we have a part of the paper where we talk about what happens in the case of single decision maker, which will have slightly different consequences. But the bottom line is that in that blank area at the bottom right, it's where basically the institutions need to be changed. Maybe the way I'm thinking of it right now, maybe a revolution can be defined in the framing of this model as a different allocation of who are the proposers and who are the decision makers. That would allow, by reshuffling who are the proposers, who are the decision makers, we are hopefully allowing reforms even in the area in which, when you take the pool of proposers and the identity of the decision makers given, we cannot do anything. I'm done. It's a bit abrupt.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Sorry for pushing, but we noticed that people tend to disappear at some point. Okay, I'm just gonna open the floor for questions. If you want to ask a question, just please unmute yourself.
I have a quick question. Something I was thinking throughout the examples you suggested is that sometimes it's the competence is on the decision maker side, right? So a lobbyist proposes a complex or simple reform, and the success of it depends on the quality of the decision maker rather than the proposer. So in this case, you could still have some sort of separation in who wants to propose what kind of reform, but maybe not in this model. But have you thought about if something similar could happen there?
Right, but in a sense, we do have it, right? Because the Z is specific to the decision maker, right? So you could imagine that specific delta, right? That specific or the starting point Z0, or even the way in which the noise evolves. I mean, or even the Z-mean could be higher or lower for different types. So in principle, you could imagine that. So we have picked one fixed decision maker that has a fixed Z-mean, maybe a fixed Z0, maybe a fixed delta. So all that structure of the simple model for how the complexity of the environment translates into his ability or inability to understand the state of the world could be specific to the decision maker, right? So in a sense, it's already there. And you could do comparative statics with respect to those characteristics as well, right?
Right. But in this case, it would be not private information of the decision maker. I was thinking of a situation where that's private information, and then there's some sort of screening of who accepts depending on their own type.
In this model, because the proposer moves first and the decision maker accepts or rejects, whether the proposer right. Okay. So no, from the point of view of the proposer, if he knows exactly what is the Z of the decision maker, or whether he does it, or whether he makes his proposal on the basis of the Z hat, expected Z of the decision maker, I don't think that makes sense.
Right. So. Okay. Thanks.
Anyone else? Really? Okay. So maybe I'm going to ask a question if nobody else is involved here. So can I ask about? I tried to think about it, but I'm getting older, so it's difficult to follow and think at the same time. You have this thing that basically the proposer only wants his proposal implemented. So some suggest that the proposer, I mean, this leads to that literature you cited, Ottaviani and Sorensen, at some point, that the proposer cares about be perceived as an expert rather than getting something. It's not that the proposer has a huge stake in the thing. Just have you thought about? I mean, I tried to think about it, but I couldn't reach a conclusion whether this matters very much in your model or not. So, for example, a proposer could have, I want the complex proposal to be, would have some policy preferences rather than just getting whatever he proposes accepted or something like that.
So if there is a correlation between ability and the preference for one or the other, it may make a difference, right? But but from the point of view of you would have, in order to make policy, in order to make complex versus simple policy preferences for the proposer kick in, well, first of all, I would have to understand how that is really fitting an example. I don't have an example where this would be the case. But in any case, it would seem to us that as long as the primary objective is to make the proposal pass, then the results of the model would go through. But
well, I mean,
if you have a proposer who either gets a complexification proposal passed or otherwise he would prefer nothing, then we have to think about it.
I'm kind of thinking of a more complex model, I guess, one where you have objectives, but there's also, you perceive some constraints. So I don't know, you are anti-guns, but you are making this proposal to the Texas legislature, you know, so you kind of, you know, propose something that you think you can get. That would probably be a different proposal to a parliament, you know, in a European country. So
it
I guess
actually fits our model. Like the fact that that in different contexts, you would make different proposals based on the probability that this proposal is accepted is exactly our point. So it's very difficult to imagine how the different policy preferences could alter the basic message we're giving, because even in the empirical studies I'm making, for example, now I'm making one on the US, on the period in which the co-sponsorship was disallowed in the House, and how things change from when you allow or not allow co-sponsorship because you change the signaling incentive. You can see the effects on bill proposals throughout the policy spectrum. It's not only left, it's not only right, it's not only Democrats, it's not only Republicans, it's not only in power or opposition. It doesn't matter. So as soon as you reduce the possibility for legislators to show what they can bring to their electorate, and so if you cut their ability to do co-sponsorship, then they will try to signal some other way, and they will start proposing bills like crazy. So imagining situations in real life in which indeed the proposer would rather abstain from making a proposal, it's quite heroic. Usually they have this type of, at least one part of their utility function is to make their proposed thing pass. Of course, if they're long-lived, they also have the signaling incentives, which actually makes things worse, which is what we should.
Okay, I think we're going to stop the recording now because it's past 4 o'clock, but we're going to stick around for a few minutes more.